Well, there's an escalating fight brewing over the future of Obamacare.
A new move from the Trump administration aims to strike down the entire law.
The Republican Party will soon be known as the party of health care. You watch.
The GOP will never stop trying to destroy the affordable health care of America's families.
The Justice Department is now telling a federal appeals court that the entire Affordable Care Act is unconstitutional and should be scrapped. Until now, the federal government was arguing only parts of the law should be struck down. As Alicia shows us in today's Digital Dive, if the court agrees, millions of people could lose their health insurance.
Yeah, I know, Lauren, that is the big question on many people's mind this morning is what if the Trump administration gives the Affordable Care Act the boot and how it could impact you and your family? Well, nearly 20 million people would lose health insurance benefits, but the impact could be much greater. So here's what could possibly happen if that is the case. 60 million people who are enrolled in Medicare. So that's senior citizens, disabled Americans. They used Obamacare to lower their premiums, deductibles, and their out-of-pocket costs. The Affordable Care Act also allowed children to remain on their parents' health insurance plan until they were 26 years old. It also helped with preventative care like checkups, mammograms, flu shots, and birth control. They were offered to people at no cost. And millions of people, they gained coverage through Obamacare, whether the Republican Party likes that or not. But if this law is struck down, those same individuals will be left uninsured. According to the Urban Institute report, that would be an increase of 65% of people who don't have health insurance. And last but not least, it could impact those with pre-existing conditions. That was one thing a lot of people liked about Obamacare was that it helped people, 1 in 4 adults actually have a pre-existing conditions, whether it's breast cancer or something in your family, genetics. So it's just something that it's definitely going to be on the minds of many come up with this 2020 election.
Well, and a lot of people, when polled, if they asked if they like Obamacare, don't like it, but they like specific parts of it very, very much. They're very popular, so there will need to be a plan to replace it.
For sure.